next speaker is the director of the Center for the Study of Racism and Ethnicity at University of Leeds and professor, Salman Sayyid. He has been, he's a political theorist whose book, Fundamental Fear, has been, is now a classic. I believe it's in the second or third edition. And it's a book related to the topics of this conference. So welcome, Salman.
Thank you. Okay, I know it's been a long day, and there's still another session to go as well. So I'll try and be very brief. I'll try and be very brief about this. And I've just got a few kind of things to say, really. Just a couple of remarks to make about the idea of measuring Islamophobia. And in fact, I have to thank the broken laptop because it's made things easier, because it's put the sequence together in a way that I think makes more sense. Because it saves me having to do a lot of the work that previous speakers have done. So I can just concentrate on a few things. It's very odd being in a room like this to realize that the kind of general consensus there seems to be is actually very, very rare. Not just because outside these walls, the Islamophobia doesn't exist. If it does exist, it's justified. And I want to talk about really the anxiety of this surplus of its denials. It's denied in many different ways. And the thing is, the more something is denied, the more you know something is actually at work. And so in a way, what I want to do in my talk is really about the surplus of the denial. And what I want to focus upon is specifically the idea that if it does exist, it's justified. And there are two kinds of very easy ways of doing that. One is simply to say, well, we have a right to be phobic about Muslims because they're trying to blow us up. And you can't get more phobic about something that's trying to blow you up, so it kind of makes sense. But there's another justification, and that's the one that I want to play on a little bit. And that is really, and I think, to do with to what extent the behavior and the phenomenon that we have all described and want to describe as Islamophobia is actually Islamophobia. In other words, for example, we saw both the statistics you provided with France, and we can repeat them with many other country examples, where you have things like, for example, attacks on persons, attacks on property, attacks on livelihood. So you have discrimination in employment, for example, and promotion. You have attacks on people various ways, spitting, verbal abuse, hitting, etc. You have pigs' heads being thrown in mosques, halal butchers, all of those things. Everyone can say these are terrible things, but are they Islamophobia? Yeah, and that's the main denial that comes into it. So there's also this whole thing about disparaging public commentary. The constant invocation, and people again say, it is terrible, it's not nice, but is it really Islamophobia? Similarly, those activities you can say occur in civil society, and but there are also activities by the state or various agencies, surveillance of Muslim populations. Yes, we do, but again, is it Islamophobia? It's just necessary. The transformation of native informants to police informers. That's an ongoing thing which is happening throughout Western plutocracies now. It's kind of erosion of various liberal rights, etc. But is it really Islamophobia? Isn't it really necessary for reasons of safety, security, etc.? So you have many of these things really about whether what is being asked is really Islamophobia. Now, it seems to me that what is at stake here is the question of Islamophobia's intentionality. I am only going to be Islamophobic if I intend to be Islamophobic. And the trouble with intentionality, it seems to me, is that it's not necessarily something one can even access. And one can't access it, therefore it's actually not possible to demonstrate that anyone had the intention of being Islamophobic, especially when they can give different kinds of rationalizations. So all the examples you would give and you can cite, you always have availability of rationalizations which do not need to present themselves in any shape, way, or form which would seem to be unfair, unreasonable, irrational. That doesn't mean that they don't exist, but there is a possibility of having a very sane debate. So for example, the analysis that you were presenting in films, you could easily have that, and people can start off by saying, I hate racism in all its forms, but these things have to be said. And there's always this thing that, I have to speak truth. And so the real cue here then, it seems to me, is that intentionality has to be placed in a particular context. Because we cannot access each other's minds, how we read intentionality is by association of other behaviors, other clues. In other words, we all need to learn how to perform so that our intentions become clear to others. And the performance is really what the key is. And this is why it's possible for people who experience Islamophobia, let's say Muslims, to pick up Islamophobia very quickly. For the same reason that people of color can pick up racism very quickly, or women can pick up danger very quickly, in a glance, without an elaboration. Because you know what the cues are. You can read them and you socialize into reading little behaviors, which if you try and explain to others, there has to be an imaginative leap of faith, or they just don't get it. Now, if that is the case, then intentionality, like I said to you, is really only accessible through context. And this is where I think things start becoming very complicated. Because what I would suggest to you is that context is not given, it's actually made. There's no already made context out there. And what this means is that many attempts to try and read Islamophobia as this kind of trans-historical phenomenon when the world has always been against Muslims. And you can read it from the Quraysh to the Crusaders to Sarkozy to whatever, this general sequence. It doesn't work. Partly because I think there's an imitation here of a particular reading of anti-Semitism, which sometimes sees it as almost this trans-historical phenomenon, but which doesn't actually take into account the very different relations of power between Muslims, who have not always been a subaltern minority. And I think that needs to be said. So often, Muslim relationships to the societies they're in is very, very different. There are countries where Muslims appear, mainly as recent arrivals, as immigrants, and in fact you have that phenomenon. There are other countries where Muslims appear at the same time as the country appeared. So there's no way that Muslims can be simply displaced as being recent arrivals. They're constituted. Leaving aside places and countries where Muslims are already in power, in some sense, are part of the fabric of the societies. So you have very different kinds of places where Muslims perform. And therefore, the question of Islamophobia has to take into account the range of theaters in where it's being performed, rather than simply saying, well, this is one kind of experience that we can see, that anyone who's against Muslims, whatever that may mean, was practicing Islamophobia. I don't think there's much sense in doing that. Now, if we're going to start talking about context, we're confronted with one big problem right now, and that is the way that neoliberal imagination has taken hold of the world. And one way to describe this is simply that we cannot find any space for structural problems or structural analysis. We only have biographical solutions for structural problems now. Therefore, in questions about racism, Islamophobia, etc., become problems of individuals. And I think you alluded to that. And it's always a lone person. The activities are activities of the deranged, the deluded, etc., if they're too extreme to be. So Andrew Breivik, for example, is a very interesting case that if you remember when the first news of the shooting came, there was a kind of a moment, I think for about 3 or 4 hours, where it wasn't sure what his identity was, and it ranged from being an Al-Qaeda operative to a recent Muslim revert Al-Qaeda operative. Then, of course, he became blue-eyed Norwegian. I don't know if he's got blue eyes, but I imagine he has. But in that range, you also saw the changing of the explanation. It went from an analysis of why would Muslim do this, to what is wrong with this individual. That there was nothing more about him and about his politics, they're very, very clear, his 1,000-page pamphlet. These are the reasons. It was simply put aside. This has nothing to do with what he's trying to do. Whereas for any action of Muslims, let's go and read the Quran to find out why they do this. Yeah? So this kind of biographicalization, this methodological individualism, makes it almost impossible to conceive of racism and Islamophobia except as individual eruptions. And as a consequence, it's almost impossible to develop, sustain social policy, because really what you might as well try and do is contain anger, stop rudeness, fight terror. Oh, you're doing that anyway, so it's okay. So, what I'd like to do is suggest that Islamophobia is a response to the emergence of Muslims. And I mean that quite specifically. It is interesting that if you look at the case of Europe, there have been halal shops, there have been many mosques and things, in some cases for 100 years, 70 years, 80 years, etc. But it is at a certain point when the various post-colonial ethnic minorities of Europe become described, not just in right-wing xenophobic literature, as Muslims. There's a kind of a sense in which there are no more Maghrebis, no more South Asians, no more Turks, they're all Muslims. And that, in a sense, is a kind of the emergence of Muslims that I'm talking about. But this is not just a phenomenon which is located in Europe, and this is one of the problems with Muslim subject position. Muslims cannot be contained in national walls. They cannot be contained in Europe, and they cannot be contained in cities. And nearly every single attempt to try and deal with the Muslim question has been to try and nationalize them, try and contain them. This ranges from a well-meaning report written in 1997 by the Runnymede Trust, which is an anti-racist organization which some of you may know about, which actually is responsible for repopularizing the category of Islamophobia. They produced two reports, one in 1997 on Islamophobia, but a prior one in 1996 on anti-Semitism. And many of the people who wrote the report on anti-Semitism were involved in writing the report on Islamophobia. So when you read those two documents, it makes quite interesting reading. And one of the interesting things is this, that anti-Semitism happens without there being any reason for blaming any Jewish groups, any Jewish individuals, any Zionist organizations. Islamophobia, though, happens because there are some Muslims and some Muslim organizations who do say and do problematic things. There is no provision in that report that Jewish organizations, Zionist organizations, should not be involved in politics outside the national, outside Britain. On the report on Islamophobia, there is a kind of advice that Muslims shouldn't really concern themselves with questions outside Britain. Now, this isn't a report which is actually criticizing Islamophobia, but it is kind of interesting to watch the transcendental category that Muslims propose. Now, this is what I would like to then say, that Muslims are not a religious or ethnographic category, and it isn't helpful for us to treat them like this. But the reason we do that is partly because of what is at stake, and I'll try and make good that claim later on. And I think the point's already been made, that Islamophobia is a post-racial form of racism, and I don't want to do that much more than that, except that I think one of the speakers in the morning mentioned how, a couple of them, how the question of, for example, homophobia now is displaced onto Muslims, patriarchy is displaced onto Muslims, and I would argue that racism is also displaced onto Muslims. So if you want to find a racist, homophobic patriarch, look for the Muslim, and you can cover it for yourself. That's kind of interesting, because what that means is that we live in a society which, of course, doesn't exercise patriarchy, which doesn't have homophobia, and certainly doesn't have racism anymore, except for Christmas time in some places, but anyway, moving on. Now, what I'd like to suggest is maybe 3 different takes on defining Islamophobia, and then I'll try and unpack them and then make good some of the claims here. I think it's important to see in Islamophobia not simply a question about closed views or negative views or hostility towards Islam. Often, this is one of the ways that we get into it, because you always get into a situation, I've got nothing against Muslims, some of my best friends are Muslims, and off it goes. Similarly with racism, some of my best friends are whatever. But the issue really is not about being best friends or enjoying ethnic food or being able to partake diversity. It's really about the regulation and disciplining of Muslims by reference to a westernizing horizon. And what I mean by this is that really all Muslim behavior and activities are supposed to be contained in reference to a horizon which is Western. And this opens up an interesting paradox, because one of the ways that countries can demonstrate and societies can demonstrate their Western credentials is by cultivating Islamophobia. And that's kind of an interesting phenomenon as well. I would also say Islamophobia then is kind of undermining the ability of Muslims as Muslims to project themselves into the future. It's an attempt to try and say, this is what a Muslim is, this is what a Muslim should be, and this is not really up to Muslims to decide. So this is why, I don't know about, you have many politicians and public speakers who will make a speech saying that we want the real, true Islam. Non-Muslims are very concerned about the true Islam suddenly. If it's that true, you should be a Muslim. I mean, it sounds logical. But if it's not that true, why are you concerned about it? But the idea is that Islam has become hijacked, and there is a sense in which there's a moderate Islam, which of course the moderation is divided, and there's also an ethical question. What is it to be moderate in the face of evil? Is that necessarily something to be applauded or not? I mean, that's another issue. But also, I think it's the undermining of Muslim autonomy by problematizing Muslim autonomy. Behind Islamophobia is a sense in that Muslim identity is somehow illegitimate. And this illegitimacy can be expressed in ways that, for example, we saw in some of the surveys in putting a contrast between national identity like Frenchness and Muslimness. But there's another way. Often you hear Islam is not a monolith. Muslims are not a monolith. And therefore the non-monolithic way is actually saying that underneath Muslims, there are people who are from Algeria, there are people from Bangladesh, there are people from all parts of the world. Like somehow being Algerian or Bangladeshi is somehow more secure than being Muslim. People don't find any problem in using national labels. All collective identity is based on the erasure of internal differences. This is nothing specific about being Muslims. But the idea somehow is that a Muslim category is more unstable and therefore deserving. It cannot be used to host anything. And one way to liberate Muslims is to dissolve Muslimness, which is paradoxical as well, but never mind. I said before about westernizing horizons, and I don't want to develop this point because I think it's quite important. In the narratives of the West and the narratives of Islam, for reasons which you don't need to go into, there is a sense in the West is the antipode of Islam. It has become that. Yeah? And that is for various reasons. It's been established. As a consequence, westernization then means de-orientalization. To be Western means a kind of de-Islamicization as well, to do it properly. And in fact, nearly all the kind of markers are that you will assimilate, and you will assimilate in the way that people have already assimilated. And in that sense, the sense of religiosity, the sense of difference disappears. And as I've said before, what this does then is establish a relationship between the West and Islam, which is not just about Muslims projecting images of the West, but it's also a way about the West projecting images, telling stories about itself. This is why it's important for it, in this era, to demonstrate that it has conquered its demons. And it can only do that by saying, look, there is no sexism in Europe anymore. It's only the Muslims who do it. And we can get a voyeuristic pleasure of watching Muslims do it, but they're the only ones who do it. And by that kind of sense of displacement, you are actually purifying that kind of Western narrative. When we talk about racism or Islamophobia, we often get into conversations about representation, which is, I think, all well and good. But the thing about representations are really about the constitution of subjects. What I'm trying to say is this, that really racism is about state formation. It's not just about attitudes and beliefs that people may have in their heads. It's about how the state was formed, is formed, and continues to be formed. Therefore, it's not about a marginal interest to people who suffer this in certain neighborhoods, in certain places. It's bigger than that. And Islamophobia, it seems to me, demonstrates how really the crisis of the European state finds some kind of relief around the bodies of Muslim women mainly, and to some extent Muslim men. That the whole idea of what the meaning of a country may be is determined by whether some women decide to wear a headscarf or not. The whole notion of values, that these values don't seem to have any power unless they can persuade all Muslims to accept them without question. So the burden of loyalty, the burden of patriotism, the burden of being true national subjects has begun to fall upon Muslims. They have to demonstrate not just their loyalty, but they have to show that the country is worth what it says it is. A very interesting kind of a moment happened this after 9/11. The question went up, why have they attacked us? And very soon the answer came back, they attacked us because we're perfect. Or they attacked us because they hate our prosperity, they hate our democracy. It wasn't said they attacked us because they thought we were supporting dictators. Whether we were or not, it doesn't matter. But it was because of our virtues. The attack was because of our virtues. And the thing is that if someone attacks you for your virtues, it's actually very comforting. It confirms that you're right, and also nothing you can do about it. You just suffer. Now, and that's the kind of, and if I wanted to play the Christian card, I would say, this is what happened last time. It's 2,000 years ago. Suffer for our sins, and it's what Christians do. This is there. But I wouldn't do that because I'm cool. I think what I'd like to suggest now is, I've talked about state formation, I'd like to say to you something about Islamophobia, which is really strange. And this is based on some information and data that we've had from Britain. Among teacher training courses for teachers, so teaching primary school children, that's from 5 years to 11, one of the things they've been asked to do in some of these courses now is to get, if they're in areas where there are large Muslim populations, to get the children to tell the teachers if their parents are making bombs in the kitchen. This is a question of 5-year-olds, right?
But what constitutes a bomb?
Well, this is the thing, you see. After 9 years old, so I'm not sure. I have to be very nice to them all the time now. But there's another element around this. The head of the former head of the secret police, the intelligence services, made a speech pointing out that the age of radicalization is dropping. So first they had people who were only radical in their 20s, and then they started getting teenage radicals, late teenagers. But now he's worried that there are people old as 13 who are becoming radicalized. So, and I'm sure you've heard that some cells have talked about anchor babies and things like that. That somehow the radicalization is now in the fetus. Now the problem with all of this is that many of these instances of the erosion of liberal rights has been happening right before our eyes. Universities who like to think of themselves as defenders of free speech, who can't wait to quote Voltaire at you whenever you want to exclude someone from speaking a racist or something like that, are now, for example, allowing central government to hire officers who sit in their universities to actually look out for radicals in the campuses. And this basically means, are there any lonely students in universities who are basically writing and reading poetry on their own and not talking to other people? And they need to be informed about that. Now, the idea that the university is now a space for regulation like this would have been unthinkable. The idea that the American government can look into every library book that you've ever taken out in your life would have been unthinkable. The hollowing out of democracy is actually one of the achievements of Islamophobia. And this is why Islamophobia is not simply something that affects Muslims. Legislation which has been introduced to try and regulate terrorism ends up being used by local authorities to make sure that you put your bins out properly. The same kinds of people, the same kind of machinery. I want to finish by saying something. I said I was going to say something about the West and Islam. And people have already made the point that there is a kind of lost. There's a sense in which in Europe, the formation of an ever closer European Union, the formation of a pan-European entity, however problematic, has really created a crisis for the nation state. And part of that crisis now finds itself around the fantasy, why can't we be the country that we're supposed to be? It's those pesky Muslims. I mean, that's kind of old kind of way. What is different about this kind of crisis of national cohesion is the way that it's becoming now securitized. So you have two kinds of threats to the nation. A security one, for which the state has always claimed complete carte blanche. In defense, in the name of security, the state has always said it can do anything it likes. And most people always agreed with that because in a sense the idea of the state is the existential one as providing defense. When you allow that to the question of cultural or social cohesion, you've actually expanded that there. So this is the thing. The other thing that I'd like to say, and this is what I'm going to say about why I think Islam is becoming this. Islam remains as a reminder of the noble Western beginnings. And this is one of the problems that you face in a kind of post-Western age. When narratives of Western supremacy do not function as they did, you don't need Muslims to remind you, well, you know what? We were here, we were not always in a subaltern position. We were not always in this situation. Spain was ours, or something like that. However you want to frame it. And that sense, and this is why, for example, in the blog site, the Gates of Vienna in 1689 or wherever it was, there's a reference again and again to the Crusaders, which of course Muslims should remind them, the Crusaders were lost. I mean, but it's a constant notion that Islam was there at the formation of what became Europe, what became the West. And therefore that changes its sense. And they're more and more difficult for it to be simply dismissed as part of the post, of a world which is no longer apparent. And finally, I'd like to say Islam is a signifier of the counterfactual because it simply names a different historical trajectory. It interrupts the sequence and allows even someone like distinguished Edward Gibbons imagining the possibility of Oxford teaching Islamic law as Muslim armies win the Battle of Poitiers and Tours, etc. So in a sense, it names one counterfactual possibility, which again shows that the idea that the West is the only way becomes more and more difficult to sustain. And therefore, I would say the final point about Islamophobia really is the delinking and the provincialization of the West and delinking from the universal. And precisely because of that, the categories that were bequeathed to us by that linking are no longer operative in the same way. Categories like religion and the categories around ethnicity and the political.